We have a body, we have emotions, and we have a spirit. And so that emotional housing really can't be worked on until we stabilize the physical body. If you feel like when these intrusive thoughts hit, or you recognize that you've hit burnout and you can't hear God's voice very well, you feel like He's abandoned you, you feel like He doesn't hear your prayers, you feel like your prayers are hitting a wall, then there's actually a physical side to things. Are you tired of the overwhelm and the nonstop anxiety and ready for simple, doable steps to beat burnout, support your body naturally, and process the heavy emotions through a biblical lens? Then you're in the right place. I'm Cassie, wife, mom of 5 home-birthed babies, and a trauma-informed women's health coach who crawled out of deep burnout myself. I learned how to rebuild my energy and my identity from the ground up. If you're ready for steadier energy, emotional stability, and joy that doesn't evaporate by noon, then grab your not coffee, take that one quiet breath you're going to get for the day, and let's dive in. Because if you're waiting for a perfect moment, you might as well pencil it in for never. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Christian Wellness for Weary Women. I am your host, Cassie Hutton, and I'm so thankful that you are here on another Tuesday, spending your day listening to what I have to say. This is episode 102, and we're going to talk about how self-sabotage is not a spiritual failure. In fact, it's probably not even spiritual warfare. I'm going to explain that in a little bit. We're going to talk about the intrusive thoughts, how it comes along with burnout, and why your brain's response to running on empty. The brain is heavily influenced by minerals, the lack thereof, or way too many, and so the brain is going to respond, and it's quite incredible all the different parts of the brain and the difference between men and women and the way that we respond to high cortisol, just the way that God designed us to think and to react, and all of those things. So if you know that you struggle with self-sabotage or intrusive thoughts that won't go away, looping patterns, I hope that this podcast really lands with you and that you are able to walk away from this episode with more grace for where you are. And when those spiraling moments hit, that you can recognize that this is the body's physiological response to a depleted state and imbalanced minerals. And I'm going to give you some questions at the end to help you kind of self-reflect and give you a starting point of what can I do today to help my body replete my minerals so that I can begin to stabilize the body itself, the physical body. Because if you don't stabilize the physical body first, then you're never going to be able to actually work on the emotional roller coaster that you're on and address the other side of things that God has designed us to fit inside of. We have a body, we have emotions, and we have a spirit. And so that emotional housing really can't be worked on until we stabilize the physical body. And then, like a podcast episode that I did, episode 92 or 93 with Carrie, really explains why when you're in deep burnout, it's really hard to hear God's voice. And so if you feel like when these intrusive thoughts hit, or you recognize that you've hit burnout and you can't hear God's voice very well, you feel like He's abandoned you, you feel like He doesn't hear your prayers, you feel like your prayers are hitting a wall, then there's actually a physical side to things, because the body is going to prioritize survival over pleasure and recreation and all of the things that life should be, which is enjoyment. It's worried about surviving because it's in a low state and depleted of all energy. Okay, so here's what I want to start with. Let's talk about some of the intrusive thoughts that might be entering into your mind. These are more along the lines of self-sabotage, where I'm going to kind of share my personal story of the real negative thoughts that entered in, but some of the self-sabotaging thoughts that I think a lot of women pose to themselves is, number one, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? Why can't I fix this? You just begin to be very hard on yourself. You begin to tell yourself, ask yourself, why am I so stupid? Why do I keep doing this? I'm weak. Everyone else can hold it together. I'm a terrible mom. Why, friend? I know I can do better, and I still can't stop. So the head and heart constantly being in disagreement. That is probably a huge one, and we're going to touch on the Bible and the spiritual side of things here in a minute, which I'm really excited to get into, because a lot of women do, like clients, when they're filling out like the reflection form and we're going into another session, if they've really had a hard week and a lot of intrusive thought struggles, they will put on there that they are having a lot of spiritual warfare. And do not get me wrong, I believe in spiritual warfare. I've not shared this a whole lot, but I've shared it like in my book and the book Finding Freedom that you can order on Amazon. I've written my personal testimony, and I've shared a little bit about my deliverance story. Like, I was actually delivered from a stronghold, which was the spirit of error, which is mentioned in 1 John. He specifically mentions the spirit of error, and I know for a fact that I was delivered of this spirit, demon, stronghold. It definitely had an influence over my mind and my thought patterns. I thought a lot like the world, and if you go read that chapter, he's talking a lot about worldly thoughts and worldly people and how they respond. And so I just say that to say I do not diminish spiritual warfare at all. But we have to know the difference. We have to know in context what's going on in the body so that we can actually understand, okay, is this my body's just physiological response to depletion, or could it actually be spiritual warfare? And so context is everything. We know that. A lot of people will argue that with the Bible and, you have to know the context of what it was written in and who was writing it and the culture of the day and all of those things. And so context matters when we're talking about burnout and intrusive thoughts as to whether or not we can gauge if they are spiritual warfare or our body's physical response to living in survival mode, okay? So let's start with that, because let me just share my story a little bit. So a little bit more of the intrusive thoughts that would happen for me, because I want you to know that whatever you're experiencing, I hate to use the word normal, but it's normal whenever you are surviving every day and not living in a place of repletion and enjoyment and support. When you're living in a place of loneliness and isolation, this is a lot of times where, we're not having the good hormones produced that need to be reduced, and a lot of the stress hormones are the ones that are living abundantly, and it needs to be opposite. And so after I had my fourth baby, we had just moved into a tiny home, and it was about 8 weeks later that I got my cycle back. I was breastfeeding, and so this wasn't normal. And I won't even say it was like a full cycle. It was kind of like, oh, what's going on? Like, there's some spotting going on. There's some bleeding going on. I don't know if this is a period, not a period. I'm not sure. But what was coupled with that was extreme mood swings. And so it started out as me just kind of like crying and not really knowing why I was crying. And then it turned into just feeling extremely stressed. So this wasn't just normal postpartum stress every day of, I now have a new baby at home. This was, no, I'm crying because I am very anxious about how I'm going to be able to get up and cook my kids' food, because I don't have the physical energy to get up and do it. But if you're a mom and you're at home and you're cooking 3 meals a day for a family of 7, that takes a lot of brain calories, okay? So you're constantly having to think about food, plan food, grocery shop for the food, thaw the food out. You have to plan it. Like, this is a constant planning ahead, right? And if you don't have it prepared and you're not ahead of the game, then the emotional breakdown of the toddler's getting too hungry, and then I'm breastfeeding, and so I'm extremely hungry all the time. And so, okay, there's this spiral out of control. And so those types of things would just really get me down. Like, I can't feed another human being today. I just cannot do it. And so I would break down and cry. And then the negative thought patterns that would enter into my mind are a lot of the ones of what I've already mentioned. You're not good enough. But I would really get angry at God. And I would say to God, if you're the one that made me a mother, you're the one that says that this is like what a blessing is to have children, be fruitful and multiply. But yet, because I had children, this is what happened to me. I'm in such a depleted state that I can't even take care of the kids. This is not fair. This is not right. And your word says that you will be there for me, and you're not here for me at all. And then that would turn into, I was being very honest with him, and hear nothing, still hear nothing, have no support from God whatsoever. Felt like I really lacked support from my husband. He would try to do physical things for me, but the emotional support was really what I needed. I needed him to hold me emotionally because my emotions were so incredibly all over the place. But he had a hard time doing that. And so when I would get super emotional, we both would escalate. And so things would turn really ugly really quickly. On top of me already being stressed, I didn't have anyone to help bring me down. And so the stress was just constant. And then I would tell myself, okay, well, now I can't even turn to my husband, so I just have to deal with this alone. I just have to deal with it. God's not here. My husband's not here. And then that turned into when I was cycling every 2 weeks. I would have the hormonal shifts like that every 2 weeks. On top of that, still breastfeeding. And when my body would come to that place where it was fixing to cycle again, the intrusive thoughts became so severe that they would become, I never threatened my life, but I did think about death. I thought about how much easier it would be to just be gone. But a lot of just terrible, terrible words would go through my mind. Cuss words, cussing at myself, cussing at God, angry at my husband, just thoughts of super, super, super angry. F this, F that, GD, like all of the cuss words that you can possibly think of would just roll through my brain. And I couldn't, there was no, once the spiraling hit, there was no capacity to stop it, okay? So you think about 2 Corinthians where it says to take every thought captive. That was not a possibility for me. And it helped me to really understand how if we're just throwing these things out there kind of in judgment of other people, that, well, they're not just, aren't practicing their biblical values. They're not putting into practice what Scripture says to do. We're really in a place of judgment because, and I'm not saying that everyone's in this place, but the body does many times, and I think especially for women, come to a place where it does not have the capacity to calm itself down. There were definitely moments where there was no capacity to take my thought captive. I could even think that to myself, but I could feel it in my body. My body was not going to respond to it. The only thing that was going to help me calm down was for someone to meet me emotionally where I was at. And I didn't have that. And so if you have that, consider yourself very blessed. If you have a spouse that is able to help regulate your emotions, then you're already way ahead of the game. I'll just throw that out there for you, okay? So there's a little bit more of my story. I definitely have clients that go through this, and it just depends on how each client's body and their DNA is going to react to low depleted minerals and then their mineral pattern itself. And for instance, if you have, well, we're going to get into that in just a second, the physiological side of things. But when your HTMA test, let's just use HTMA in general, but it doesn't matter. When you can prove that the body is in a depleted state. So let's just say you don't even have to prove it with a testing. You can prove it with what kind of symptoms are going on in your body. We can tell if you are in a low energetic state or not, but how low energetic of a state is it? Let's look at your symptoms. What's going on? Are you experiencing autoimmune disease? Are you experiencing weight gain? Are you experiencing, how severe are your symptoms? And we can go, oh, well, you're definitely in a very low energetic state. You're depleted. Your minerals are definitely off balance, and the brain is highly affected by that. Then we can probably say that it's likely not spiritual warfare because of that. And we can look at some other things going on in your life to determine that. But what I'm saying is, this is why praying it out, looking up anxiety Bible verses, rebuking it is not really working. And again, I don't want anyone to hear me say that Cassie doesn't believe that the Bible is truth or powerful or anything like that. The word itself is what delivered me of the spirit of error. So don't hear me say that. So because the intrusive thoughts feel super demonic, because they're all negative, they're all dark, they're all about death. But it's still, again, the body trying to find a place to survive. The body is going to prioritize survival no matter what. And so the spiral can definitely feel like an attack. And that might not be wrong. I'm not saying that it isn't. And that scripture is clear that we have an enemy and that the spiritual warfare is definitely real. So I'm not diminishing that, but both can be true at the same time, or one can be true over the other. And when we're in a low energetic state, it is easier for the enemy to attack us and get into our life. This is why, Jesus in the wilderness, he was physically weak, and that's when he was attacked the most. But again, let's consider a few things that are going on. And I hope, again, that this gives you some grace for yourself when you walk away from what I have to say from this episode. So here's the weapon that I obviously would like to see you fight with, especially if you feel like maybe this is possibly not spiritual warfare anymore. This is just my body being like, F you because you haven't taken care of me. Nutrition and physical stability is the first step for anything. Like, we're not going to be able to work on the emotional side of things or the spiritual side of things until we just get your body in a stable position where it can balance its blood sugar, where it can regulate its emotions, where it gets out of the fight or flight freeze mode and is able to go, okay, I physically am safe again. Now let's work on emotional safety. And then thirdly, replacing lies with truth. All right, now let's turn to what is actually happening to your brain whenever you are in a low depleted state. You're lacking minerals. Your minerals are all over the place. Your cortisol is all over the place. Your blood sugar is all over the place. You're just completely dysregulated. So your brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in your body. It is more sensitive to mineral shifts than any other organ in the body. Let's touch on magnesium for a minute. We've talked a little bit about magnesium in some of the past episodes. And so here's some other things that magnesium does. It's involved in more than 300 enzymatic reactions, which many are tied directly to mood and stress regulation. We look at magnesium when it comes to the adrenals, and the adrenals is what's tied to cortisol. Okay, so magnesium is huge. Without enough magnesium, the brain cannot make adequate serotonin or dopamine. It cannot buffer cortisol the way that it needs to. And so the result is that you become reactive, you become hypervigilant, you have no capacity for nuance or grace. There is no gray area, okay? And then I want to touch on cobalt. We've not touched on this one much. So cobalt is the mineral core of B12. So cobalt sits in the middle of B12. And so anytime that we're looking at cobalt on an HTMA test, we can kind of tell where your B12 levels are at. If we see cobalt really high on an HTMA test, this tells us that you have a really overburdened liver and you need help in the methylation area. You need help in the detoxification area. If it's really low, then we definitely know you are really low in B12 and you likely have really low stomach acid. If it's high, going back to B12, if it's high, you not only have an overburdened liver, but you have a body who's not processing B12 at all. It's not that you have high B12 because you have high cobalt. It's that the B12 is just sitting there and the body's not digesting it or using it properly. Now, if cobalt is low, then we can say the body doesn't actually have B12. So when cobalt is depleted, nerve signaling slows and becomes imprecise. And so again, this is affecting the brain. This is when we see brain fog show up. You forget your words often, thoughts that you can't catch. This is like the nervous system without what it needs to fire properly. So we're going to talk about a couple of different parts of the brain. You have your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thoughts, perspective, nuance. This is where when the prefrontal cortex when the body has the capacity to access the prefrontal cortex, this is where you would say to yourself, I made a mistake, I'll fix it, I messed up, it's not that big of a deal, I'll fix it tomorrow or I'll fix it next time. But whenever the body has been living in this hypervigilant state with extremely high cortisol levels, or you've gone through an extreme trauma, this is where the amygdala gets turned on. The amygdala is what houses fear. Like if you had no amygdala, you would not feel fear. The amygdala runs very fast. It's binary, meaning that it holds absolutes. So black, white, right, wrong. And this is why things that you tell yourself can become truth to you, because the amygdala has taken over and there is no middle ground anymore. It's only worried about survival. It's worried about safe or unsafe, good or bad. There is no grace when the amygdala is the one doing all the talking instead of the prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex can only be triggered when you feel safe. So in other words, if you've ever watched, I remember listening to something and I was learning about the amygdala a while back because I had a dream about my son and the amygdala, and he was having seizures. And I thought, okay, there's a link between this, because I don't talk about the amygdala at the time. There was no, I had heard that word before, but this was not something in my vocabulary or something I had studied or that I knew anything about. And then all of a sudden I have a dream about it, and it was like the amygdala. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And so I remember watching like a cop show where this scenario was going on, and a woman thought she was grabbing her taser gun in a battle. Something was going on, a man or a woman. I think it was a woman though. She thought she was grabbing her taser gun, and she actually grabbed her pistol and she shot a man and killed him. And in the courtroom, they're like, don't you know the difference between how much your gun weighs and your taser weighs? And immediately in my mind, I was like, well, no, because she was in survival mode. Her brain wasn't logically thinking, oh, this is too heavy or this is too light. This must not be my taser gun. If she felt like she was truly in a fight for her life, then no, she did not have the logical reasoning to think about that. So that's just an example of how the amygdala takes over. And whenever we're talking about not being able to handle gray areas, this is where I want to bring in John 1:16, because it says, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. And whenever you hit burnout, you feel like that grace is gone. In other words, capacity upon capacity. You once had the capacity to think logically, to hold space for doing all the different activities you wanted to do during the day. You had space to think about things and organize things in your brain, but now all of a sudden that capacity is gone. And so you have to kind of regress so that we can build that physical foundation again, so that you can build the grace upon grace again. And so this can be why, if you've ever noticed, when you try to do what 2 Corinthians says and take that thought captive, that you feel like the thoughts actually get faster. They like run away from you. You probably know that feeling. It's because the prefrontal cortex has functionally gone offline, so to speak, and the amygdala is taken over, because it is where fear is housed, the trauma is housed. When the central nervous system is no longer in rest and digest, we're now in survival mode, then things are going very, very fast, and that's when things just kind of go haywire. So the other interesting thing about burnout, and well, let's talk about stress a little bit, because we know when stress rises, so do cortisol levels. And this is very fascinating to me. It's terrible, but it's very fascinating that when stress rises in the body, the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's like for memory, and it's kind of like our learning center, and it's extremely highly sensitive to cortisol. And chronically elevated cortisol actually shrinks the hippocampal volume and its function over time. This is kind of crazy if you think about it, and the way you think that God created us, that we're literally not created to carry stress. And that this is what stress does to our bodies. This is actually why we die now, because stress is something that God never intended us to walk through. This is something that He never intended us to carry. And so sin creates stress in our life. And the ability to hold a thought whenever the hippocampus begins to shrink, the ability to hold a thought long enough to actually examine it becomes genuinely impaired. And so you can see how thinking about our own thoughts or taking every thought captive, like Paul is suggesting in 2 Corinthians, can be very hard to do, because can a depleted woman's brain physically do what this verse is asking us to do without the mineral resources to access the prefrontal cortex that would actually allow you to examine your own thoughts? So where Paul was coming from was from someone in a healthy body, from someone who wasn't under extreme stress and dealing with extreme depletion to the point that their body is screaming at them, okay? And so this is what I really just want to address this, because again, going back to the fact that a lot of women, whenever they have these intrusive thoughts, they believe that it's spiritual warfare. And again, while I'm not discounting that, there's a real biological factor to what's going on. And you don't just need deliverance. You don't just need to pray it away and rebuke it away. That's the wrong tool in this scenario. You really need nutrition, rest, help, and those types of things. And we really need to create a system where the body begins to function and come back to a place of safety again. Let's talk about sodium's role in the body for a minute, because I do encounter some people with high sodium levels. And when you have high sodium levels, this is salt, right? If you've ever heard the term that they're salty, this is actually a term that fits the scenario. If you have high sodium levels, you are volatile. You can lash out unexpectedly at things like that, at things that don't really necessarily need lashing out at, or it can feel like everything's calm and fine, and then all of a sudden someone blows up. You could be dealing with someone who has high sodium levels, or you yourself, if you notice that pattern, could be dealing with high sodium levels, especially whenever it's high relative to other minerals that keep the nervous system in a low level activation, because sodium is an excitatory mineral along with potassium. And then when you have calcium and magnesium that are really low, those are those calming minerals in the body. And so if you don't have the calming minerals and you've only got the excitatory minerals, then there can definitely be some volatile moments that pop up in your life, and you overreact or you burst out, and then you might hit that shame wall and beat yourself up, and you spiral into these different thresholds throughout the day or throughout the week, because sensory input hits harder, emotions come faster, and the wherewithal, the capacity to hold everything again is just not there anymore. And so this is why small things land like big things, and why intrusive thoughts can feel a lot louder and a lot more than what they actually are. So let's move along into just some practical things that you can do to bridge the gap here while you're working on your nutrition and eating a lot more protein. Protein has a huge effect on the brain, because the body has to have protein in order for the neurotransmitters in the brain. So if you're eating a low protein diet, this can also affect you. Obviously, if you're not getting the minerals and just those essential nutrients into your diet, then you're not going to have what the body needs in order to rebuild and regain. And so a protein can also be a big one in that. And I didn't mention that in this podcast yet. So some of the things that you can do instead of beating yourself up for the spiraling and the going out of control, I want you to begin to notice it and begin to remind yourself that this is my depleted nervous system at work here. This is not the truth about who I am. This is not who I've become. I can work my way out of this. I can repair from this, and let it pass without feeding it. Don't debate it. Don't engage it. You need to just let it move through. Let it move through, because there's no way you can logically move your way out of an amygdala response when the prefrontal cortex is offline. There is no logical reasoning going on. You have to stop trying that. And so here's some questions that I want to ask you and leave you with before we go. So I've got 5 questions here, and you can pause, you can write these down, do what you need to do to ask yourself these questions, sit with these questions, and really reflect on some things. But again, I just really hope that this podcast helps you to walk away with giving yourself more grace. So here's question number 1. What would change for you if you stopped treating this as a character flaw and start treating it as a body signal? This is your body's way of communicating with you, letting you know, hey, something's wrong here. Kind of like a toddler throwing a temper tantrum. When a toddler's not able to speak very well, they don't have the words, they come out jumbled, and you're learning to hear your toddler better, and you're learning what this little phrase that's coming out of their mouth actually means. And so for a long time, you and the toddler are very frustrated, and so the toddler will begin to throw a fit because they're frustrated. But once you finally hear what the toddler's saying and you meet that need from the toddler, then the toddler stops screaming. And that's the same way with the body. The body begins to speak to you. The body begins to communicate with you, but you may not recognize it. You probably didn't recognize it. And if you're fully on burnout, you're probably beginning to recognize some of the red flags that your body was throwing up at one point. But now the body's screaming at you. It's throwing a temper tantrum. It is on the floor, rolling around, screaming, crying, doing whatever it can do to get your attention so that you will meet its need. And once you meet that body's need, it will stop throwing the temper tantrum. In other words, it will stop giving you out all the bodily symptoms that you're experiencing. Question number 2. Where have you been the hardest on yourself for something that may have been your biology all along? Number 3, what have you been white-knuckling spiritually that your body may actually need support with? Where do you keep pushing through? Where do you keep trying harder? What if it's actually your body's way of just needing support physically? Number 4, if depletion has been driving this, what is one thing you could do this week to start resourcing your body? Resourcing, repleting your body. What's one thing you could do this week? And take that action step. Just start there. Number 5, what would change if you stopped treating the pattern as a spiritual verdict and started treating it like a bodily signal again? So I love the word verdict, because when we're in burnout, that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like just this end of the road. This is what's going to happen, and there's no other choice. But that's not the truth. It just starts with one thing. What's one thing you can do today and this week to start helping your body again? Because God did make our bodies to heal, and that is the beauty of it. We're made from the dust, and so we can replete the dust. We can put things back into our soil by feeding it compost back into the ground, and so can we replete our bodies with good, nutritious foods by filling our gut with good things, not things that's going to harm it, okay? And I don't just mean eating clean foods. I mean figuring out what is your body reacting to, even if it's clean foods, even if it's organic. You may have to cut out grains for a while. You may have to cut out complex carbs for a while. You may have to do a week's worth of some soft, really soft, brothy foods to give your gut a moment to stop digesting and to start repairing the gut lining so that it's not inflamed anymore. Give it a break. These are just simple things that could do. And so that's all that I have for you on that part. I think that on this week's episode, I just think it's incredible the way that our body can respond to keep us alive. Unfortunately, when we're in that survival state, it doesn't feel incredible. It doesn't feel like something that we want to walk through, but it is necessary in order for change to come, because it's our body's way of getting our attention. It's the built-in design that God gave us so that we wake up to seeing that we're not treating our bodies the way that we need it. That we truly need to treat it like the temple that God gave us, to really honor it, to really hone in on it, instead of having this mindset that I'm young, I can push through it, my body can handle it, because at some point the body's not going to be able to handle it. And so we want to give it set it up for the best possible outcome that we can. It's not just that we get old, it's that sin and eating crappy foods pushes us to an earlier death. And even if it's not an earlier death, it's just going to be a very painful death if we're not taking care of our bodies. And we don't want that. We don't want to suffer during our last days here on earth. We don't want to have low metabolic energy for the last 20 years of our life, where we can't play with our grandkids, where we can't enjoy our grandkids, where we can't enjoy life because our body's just worried about surviving each day. No, that's not what we want. And that's why you're here. That's why you're listening to this podcast. And so I appreciate you being here. Reach out to me if you ever want to run an HTMA test on yourself and you want to see where your mineral levels are at. And if you are dealing with the spiraling thoughts, I'm praying for you. I've been where you're at. I know how terrible that it can get. And I haven't even shared, I've maybe been past the first layer of how actually terrible things got in my life and how dark they got for years. Okay. It didn't just happen for a few months. It didn't happen for a year. It was years of me getting out of this and going around the mountain each and every month, feeling like I may just never get out of this again. But healing is there and it is for you. And God has given you everything that you need and empowered you with the right choices and the things to do. It just takes starting. Start somewhere and reach out for help. I'm always here for you. Find a friend, find a Facebook group, get in my Facebook group. I invite you to join Christian Wellness for Weary Women. It's titled the same title as the podcast, and come in there. I have not been super active in the last month or so, but it's there so that you can gather with like-minded women who want to take care of their bodies and who really care about how God designed us and who are really there struggling with a lot of the same things and are ready and willing to get out of burnout. Okay. So with that, I'll see you guys next week on the next podcast episode. Bye. Hey ladies, I hope today's episode hit you where you needed it. If it did, take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who's burnt out, praying for relief, and tired of feeling like God's strength is for everyone but her. And if you haven't yet, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more women get the support they've been begging God for. Now I'm off to make my adrenal cocktail and do the slow, steady work that pulled me out of survival mode. I'll meet you back here next Tuesday for another episode. Bye!